All right. What is the nerdiest piece of financial planning knowledge you can think of that's broadly applicable, though? Like, I don't want to hear about insurance shares, for example. Broadly applicable to, listeners in the audience.
Nerdiest piece of financial. Is it one of the things that drives me nuts?
No,
We
no,
got
because we, we,
questions
we
for that?
we have questions about that too.
All right, let's nerdiest piece. Nerdiest piece of financial.
Hypothetically speaking.
Oh man, there's so many. I don't know which one. Like to me, it's just everything. Can we come back to this? Let's park this. I'm gonna try to come back to this later. Okay.
Okay.
We'll see
come
what
back
else
to
we
that
don't
one later.
tackle.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, here's one for you then. What's your favorite, again, hypothetically speaking, what's your favorite financial planning related argument to get into on the internet? Think outside the box here, Jason. I mean, just
Okay, so
imagine you get
outside
into
the box,
arguments.
outside the box,
I'm just,
and it's look, Tabasco's not the best hot sauce. I'm going to call it out right now, right? McGrath, you know I'm right. You just won't admit it, okay? First and foremost, okay? Now, that is semi-related to financial planning, just trust me. But as for the rest of it, I mean, take your pick. The 4% rule, as if God chiseled on stone that thou shalt take 4% and you'll be perfectly fine. Never mind the fact people can't quote it right and think it's 4% per year. Dividends are a way to alpha. Like, give me a break. Whole life is immune from market volatility. Don't get me started on that one. Alts have low risk. I have very little hair left in my head, and Cliff Asness got there first, and part of it was probably because he was raving about volatility laundering and how that's just not the case. And then the fact that people think they can read a newspaper or stuff online, and that's how I pick my stocks, and I'm going to outperform managers. And it's just like, have you not read enough Michael Lewis books? Right? Like, have you not seen, I think it was Patrick O'Shaughnessy said, like, early on in his podcast, it was like 50, 60 episodes, that he's like, I'm just going to start. I realized I should have called this podcast, This Is Who You're Up Against, right? Like, this is a guy talking to the most sophisticated hedge fund managers in the world and the resources they bring to bear. And when you realize that this is like, you're either being billed or the killer in the market, really, or you're taking the average, but like, you're either the prey or the predator. There's no way reading yesterday's stale news has anything to do with actually succeeding. And you know what? The reality is that you want to argue with me about that? Like, usually you're just arguing vibes and feelings because I'm throwing stuff at you that proves it. So, it is what it is.
I've definitely seen you get into all of those arguments on the internet.
Yes, it's a wonderful place.
What role should mortality pooling theoretically play in financial planning?
Okay, so to define that for those who aren't going to know, like, mortality risk pooling is what you get when you're in a member of a pension or an annuity, and you theoretically, and you benefit if the longer you live because people who died before you basically left behind either return or their money, whatever else it is. But that's basically it. So the classic financial advisor and planner answer, it depends. Look, for some people, it doesn't matter at all. Like, we're privileged enough to deal with clients who are so wealthy that they earn 0% rate of return for the rest of their lives. They're going to be perfectly fine. But even for them, maybe they want to simply lock in their annuity, for example, guarantee themselves an income stream for life, take greater risk in the rest of their portfolio, and leave a larger estate. That's possible if that's what they want to do. For others, where it's not the case, look, there's a kind of a middle ground, right? There's those who have so little that they're not going to be able to hit their goals, and no amount of mortality risk pooling is going to do anything. But there's a middle ground in between where we do a financial plan, we test the Monte Carlo test or whatever test we're going to test, and we find that, look, the probability is not great. Is there a way to enhance this? And the answer, if we throw an annuity in, sometime can increase something that was in the 60s to the 90s, right? So what role does it play? It's case specific. Can it help people? Absolutely. And especially, I mean, selection bias here, especially if you are someone with longevity and health in your family and all this other stuff, you're basically going to win this bet. I mean, I like to joke, my wife is the teacher's pension plan's worst nightmare. Her grandmother died 6 months before her 101st birthday, right? So, like, I'm sitting there going, like, she's going to retire like 56. This is a no-brainer to me. She's going to win this thing, God touch wood, God bless, right? But so the answer is, again, it depends. So it depends on the personal financial situation, but also, are you the person with 3 heart attacks and the stroke and everything else? Like, you're not long for this world. Are you the person with longevity in the family? You are, right? So there's a middle ground. But there's also, again, I think, frankly, when I get to the age where maybe I buy in a lot, maybe I look at an annuity or whatever products exist in the market, do I consider like locking in some of my spending in such a manner? Yeah, I probably would, because again, I think I'm on the longer tail, probably based on health and history. And if that's the case, then hey, why not take some of that stress out of the marketplace? Why not basically benefit from the mortality risk pooling and make my situation more secure?
Totally sensible. So why is mortality pooling such a hard sell to clients?
So different theories on this. I think first off, it comes down to when it comes to buying annuities, right? It's the endowment effect, right? Like you're asking people to part with a check, which might be the second biggest check to buy something that they've done short of buying a house, right? Like we're talking usually 5, 6, 7-figure numbers, right? So there's a lot of fright there, and it's something that they're not going to be able to undo the next day, right? So I mean, there's a cooling off period, but next month they're not going to be able to do it next month. So the point is that endowment effect, I think, is incredibly powerful, right? There's also, I think, a lack of understanding of the upside of the upside of mortality risk pooling, right? Everybody's like, well, interest rates could be higher in 6 months. I can do better. That's beside the point. That's beside the point, because that's 6 months from now. But the reality is that if you're beyond average life expectancy, the mortality credits are so much bigger than you would ever earn in that delta in interest. It's an issue, right? Like you're gonna basically make a lot more. And then the other idea is that basically, I think that the entire idea of not keeping, again, endowment effect, the entire idea of not getting back what you put into it. You can get refund annuities, but they pay less. I think that bothers people. And then there is an entire like morbid aspect of this, right? It's like, wait a minute, I'm benefiting from people dying. Yeah, you are. You want to be part of the teacher's pension plan or hoop? Most people do, right? Like you take that, but the reality is that when you're making that decision on a personal level, and that's how you learn about that, that's how it works. Some people think it's pretty morbid. So, but one last thing, we don't have a lot of good options in Canada. We don't have a variable annuity market like the US does, where it comes with additional tax deferral benefits. I think that tax deferral benefit really does basically lead to more sales in that marketplace as well. Whereas because we just don't have that benefit, it's purely a play on longevity, which is not as compelling.
Canada had these products launched over the last 5 or so years that were, we called them tontines, which they weren't technically, but it's like a blend of an annuity and an investment product. And they seem really interesting. Like you and I, Jason, chatted about them a ton when they first came out, and we were like, this is pretty cool. But they have not been successful. Why do you think they've kind of failed?
I was actually looking back here for Malevsky's book on tontines. It's somewhere around there. Anyway, so look, these are products which are investment products with a mortality risk pool. So no insurance company, but you are basically putting money into a pool. And if you live longer, you win. And if you don't, you basically are giving something up, whether that be the entire amount or just your return, right? So it's a way of getting an annuity or a variable payout on the annuity, because it depends on what happens to the pool, that is far more affordable than an annuity, right? And the reason why, why did it not take off in Canada? Look, first and foremost, advisor education, lack of understanding. I just know even online, the conversations or arguments or debates I get into with advisors regarding longevity planning is orders of magnitude more sophisticated with American advisors than it is in Canada. Like we just don't talk about it here. Retirement planning is retirement income planning is like, let's shift them to dividend paying stock and put a cash wedge in, which by the way is a term that only exists in Canada. So that tells you something's wrong. So it's a complete and total lack of appreciation for the challenges of mortality in Canada. I even wrote a series in the Globe and Mail on this, on looking at different products, but also explaining mortality planning in general. So that, I think, first and foremost is, if you don't understand how the problem really works or how the problem actually exists, then you don't understand the need to solve it. And then you have the second piece, which is on the product side. Again, there's some complexity to this, right? I reverse engineered the math on some of this stuff, and it's not easy, right? But the reality is, I looked at this and said, like, hey, I'll call out Purpose is the only one who's still got one left, and I'll call them out on it. The assumptions they used on that thing were very conservative. And I was like, okay, great. You set yourself up for future distributions increasing at a faster rate than would otherwise. Now, that whether that happens or not, that's entirely up to chance in the market. But the reality is, I'm looking at this, and I've spoken to them about marketing it, and I said, listen, what you really need to do is you need to tell, play to, for lack of a better term, play to greed, right? Show them charts on like what the projected payouts are later on in life and how much of that's made up of mortality credits. Because right now, the distributions are largely return with tiny little bit of mortality credit, if that at all. But over time, roll the camera forward 20 years, and the mortality credit's going to start to far exceed the interest payment. So when you start to, if you actually people understood the upside of mortality credits, I think there would be far more demand for it. And then the last part is, and I'll say this much, there unfortunately is no model framework that's fully accepted in academia for a calculator on, okay, I've got conventional investments, annuities, and tontines. How do I allocate between the three to get the optimal scenario? It's not there. It doesn't exist yet. There used to be one of these for older products called guaranteed minimum draw benefits, which again, I'll credit Milevsky. He created that, which you hit a button and boom, it was like, here's the product allocation between the three that gives you the optimal outcome. It doesn't exist for tontines. So not knowing exactly how much of this you should even expose people to is a challenge.
When does permanent life insurance make sense?
Okay. So let's look at life insurance in general. Okay. There's three different needs it services. First is indemnity. I die today. I'm taking care of the people I left behind because I haven't amassed enough wealth to make sure my kids and my wife are going to be fine, right? That's the first piece. The second piece of the other end of the spectrum is I have a permanent need or a semi-permanent need. I own a business. I have no plans on selling it anytime soon. I'm going to eventually die. I'm going to pass it on to my kids, whatever else it is. I have a tax bill associated with that business or a cottage, which is far more common, right? Maybe I even take steps to freeze that so I know for certainty what the amount is going to be. I have a need that is 100% conducive to my death, whether it happens today or 50 years in the future, okay? I have effectively a permanent need, 100%. Where things get muddy is when we start using it for the third reason, which is for an investment vehicle, right? So when does it make sense? It makes sense when first and foremost, there is a permanent need. Now, on the investment vehicle piece, that's debatable, right? And of course, Ben and I have been doing some early work on use of whole life as an investment vehicle. And I will say right now that it should not be the first investment vehicle, okay? RSPs, TFSAs, FHSAs, everything else, they have benefits. When you start getting into a taxable environment, is there a benefit to this stuff? The answer is, it depends as always, but it depends first and foremost on risk tolerance. The more conservative an investor you are, the more likely it is to be a positive outcome with that. So compare it to being a GIC owner or in the US CDs, right? Where you had taking no risk, right? So in that type of investment, when you compare it to a whole life policy, it starts to look a little similar, right? The value can't drop. You get returns every year and then you reinvest those and they can't drop. Now, the return or the dividends will change over time, or the projected schedule will change over time depending on age and market performance, but it can actually be a reasonable substitute for really conservative investments. And especially because that par pool is invested in diversified investments, you're getting the benefit of returns that are conducive to those higher investments that you normally would invest yourself, right? So there is potentially a place here, but we also remember that even though people tout the fact that you can borrow against it and it's flexible and all this other stuff, there is an inherent inflexibility to it as well, right? So you can't just, you cash it out, you're going to pay tax. There's a number of things you got to be aware of when it comes to the handcuffs. So not as a first option, but as an option for the people where it works, yeah, it's viable.
Yeah, there's a place for it, but it's often talked about or sold as if everybody should have a lot of it.
Well, to a man with a hammer, everything's a nail, and this is the problem: is it appropriately sold? I would say that it's oversold, and I think have you had Cole on the podcast yet? Anyway, no. So we've seen his work before, and he talked about incentives in various studies and found that yes, it tends to be sold, but when you change compensation models, suddenly other stuff that's expensive starts to be sold. So lo and behold. Okay, nerdiest piece of financial trivia. I'll give it for you. Okay, is that, and I get into arguments about this. Dividends are not tax effective. Everybody always points and says, "Oh, look, I pay less tax on dividends." Right? Now, for anyone who works with small business owners in Canada, we know how things work. There's something called integration. And that means that by the time you add the corporate tax bill and the personal tax bill, it's the same thing as you earning it personally. So when people say, well, dividends are a way to for companies to tax effectively return money to investors, no. They paid tax, you pay tax, total equals the same. It's like basically you ordered out for fries and the delivery guy ate 15, 20% of your fries before they arrived, and then you imagine it didn't happen. You have less. So when you actually look at, again, the own goals, and then when you look at foreign dividends, it's even worse, right? Because they're not tax efficient at all. In fact, in a corporation, they're even worse off. So they're not a real tax. They're in no way a tax efficient means of returning to investor or money to investors, except for in TFSAs and other tax shelter vehicles. But that just puts them on par with capital gains in other forms too, right? So it's not a big deal. But when you think about it, and you realize that interest gets deducted from an income statement on a corporation and paid out, and then it's taxed fully in an individual's hands, you're literally paying the same tax bill on dividends and interest, whether you own the bond or the stock. Capital gains are the only thing that actually have a tax preference. In particular, and I'll never understand people who think buybacks are a bad thing. I think didn't you have, I think Ken French said they separate the people who understand corporate finance from those who don't. I love that line. Because at the end of the day, I don't have to participate in the capital. I don't have to realize tax I don't want to, but I can participate when I choose to. And then I get the preferential rate. So, and it's just the same amount of money leaving a corporation. So what's the point? So that's the nerdiest piece, is that what you think is tax efficient, sorry to break it to you, it ain't.
That's a good one.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. And people look at the amount of tax that you pay on dividends at low tax brackets in Canada, and they think that that's tax-free, that you're not paying any tax. You're not paying any personal income tax, but the reason you're not is because the corporation paid your personal tax bill for you effectively, but the tax was still paid.
Yeah, and people will say to me, well, I don't care what the corporation paid. It's like, well, wait a minute, then you think that they wouldn't pay you more if they didn't have this tax bill? Oh, well, the corporate, they're just going to pay themselves more. I'm like, then why do they pay dividends at all? Right? There's this never-ending, this is the online arguments, right? These never-ending trail of nonsense arguments. Like, if they're paying dividends, it's because they have excess capital and they have a retention ratio. If they pay less tax, that retention ratio stays the same, more money comes out. So end of story.
Or your capital goes down by the amount of tax that the corporation paid. So it's
exactly.
There's no free money.
There is no free money. Like this entire, dividends are free money. Okay, let's walk away from that one.
that was good though. That's a good, broadly applicable and very nerdy piece of financial planning knowledge.
Yep.
Nailed it. You had some good articles in the Globe Mail recently on this. How should financial planners approach estimating a client's life expectancy?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. So I will say first and foremost, you start with the FP Canada guidelines. So FP Canada is, of course, the certifying body of the CFP board. Ben, you serve on the committee for guidelines. Thank you very much for your service. But they include at the back of that, in that report, the CPM 2000 tables. This is for Canadian pensioners. Now, here's the thing. People understand that there's more than one type of mortality table, right? I mean, there's gender-based mortality tables. There's smoking, non-smoking based, but CPM is for pensioners. Now, there's a phenomenon where people who collect pensions live longer than people who don't. Maybe it's due to income security. We can speculate. I'm not going to get into that. But the point is that inherently, by using the longer-lived mortality tables, FP Canada is saying use the more conservative assumption. That's a great starting point. Okay, so you start with that, and they will tell you that you should start there. Now, the thing you got to remember about mortality is that life expectancy is a 50% interval, which means your odds of living beyond it are beyond 50%. So you can't, or are 50% exactly. So you can't just use the 50% interval. So I think FP Canada's guidelines are to use the 25% interval and then potentially add another couple of years. I think that's a great starting point. I think that they've done the right conservative thing. Now, people hate the conservative thing because it means theoretically, if you're trying to bounce the last check, you spend less money. Frankly, I always make the bad joke that if you're bouncing the last check, it better be for the thing that kills you, because there's no way to guarantee that. But you start with that, and then you have to take personal situation into consideration, right? Again, are they super healthy, like member of another clinic, jog all the time, long-lived parents? Those things all point towards you're probably going to win this bet. And then on the other side of it, are you the guy who's had 3 heart attacks and is massively overweight and doesn't work out at all? Adjust it. But the other thing is that doesn't get mentioned, and this was mentioned in an article by an advisor who services the Indigenous community in Canada, basically said that basically, First Nations average life expectancy is lower in general because of various issues and social issues. So when you tell them that you're planning for age 90, it's almost insulting to them, right? So I think we have to be, as planners, aware of who the individual is across from us, from health-wise and maybe other issues, to inform that decision, to inform that talk, right? As opposed to just applying a simple rule all the time. Now, that being said, if you want to start with that simple rule and the client says, look, I'm not going to live that long, it's like, okay, great. Let's have that conversation. Why is it you think that, right? Oh, none of my parents lived that long. Okay, well, lifespans have gone on. How did they pass away? Well, natural cause. Okay, fine. You can have this back and forth and educate them to say, like, oftentimes people say, why are you doing that? Life expectancy is only 84. And I'm like, okay, here's how life expectancy works. 50% chance you live beyond it. You have believe it or not, you and your spouse have a 1 in 10 chance of one of you living past that age. Really? Yeah, that's real. That's something we got to plan for.
I find the data on income and both life expectancy and health span, I find those data to be super uncomfortable, because there's big gaps between the lowest income and highest income life expectancy and health span in Canada, which is a pretty ugly fact.
It is ugly, but at the end of the day, there's a correlation between wealth and outcome, and health. That's just it. Unfortunately, some of it's job determination, because again, higher paying jobs, with some exceptions, tend to be more white collar and less brutal. And then of course, health spend. It's a big delta. I mean, it's some of us have the option of going to the U.S. or elsewhere if we feel like the lines are too long here, right? Like, it's a thing. Not everyone's got that option.
Yeah.
So here's a subject, Jason, you know a little bit about. What financial designations should clients be looking for when they hire a financial advisor?
Good question. So you said advisor, right? Let's just establish something. Financial planner is a term that's well defined and has an ISO code and has international standards body and has regional standards councils that put in place regional designations. Financial advisors, 2 words put together that, even though some provinces license it, I was not in favor of that, because there's no clear definition as to what that means. So let's talk about planners, right? Okay. So, we'll talk about designations and go back to that. So first off, you can't take titles at face value, right? And at least there's been some work done in Canada to stop making everyone in a bank a vice president, which was just absurd. But it's still a thing to some lesser degree. And there are some provinces that prevent you from using the term financial planner unless you actually have certain designations. All positive steps. So first and foremost, the CFP, the Certified Financial Planner, accept no imitations. There is an imitator out there, but it's the Olympic acronym CFP. That is the global standard. That is the first thing you should be looking for when dealing with the planner. Okay, they've done a lot of work to bring that standard up, and I'm very happy and confident with the level of testing and the level of what is expected to be known for someone in there. Then from there, there's the other financial planning. Again, I'm biased here. I'm also on the board, but the RFP designation, the Registered Financial Planning designation, is a secondary designation beyond the CFP. That is a smaller group of financial planners who are actually actively engaged in the business of producing actual financial plans. So you can get a CFP and never produce a financial plan, but an RFP, you can't be that. Okay. Not to say the CFP isn't great. It's great, but it's a different level of specialization to me. Of course, on the investing side, CFA, Ben and I both survived PTSD with that one. It was brutal. It's not fully necessary, but it is something that does say that person's committed themselves to a level of understanding of the markets.
Sure does.
Sorry?
Sure does.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, it really does. You're committing yourself to pain and possibly breaking up your relationships when you take that. Okay. I saw it happen to other people. The TEP, the Trust and Estate Practitioners, basically a very growing one in Canada, right? Not as recognized in the US. There's other ones in the US, but actually Canada has the highest number of TEPs in the world. So this is one where it's an estate planning and tax planning designation specifically around estates. So if you're doing that, you've got a certain level of proficiency around trusts and estates that, frankly, no other designation can touch. Of course, one of the things that the industry does lack is a tax designation, other than someone having a CPA or whatever. Like, CPA is not necessary for financial planning, but I would love to see someone come up with a highly credible tax and accounting designation that advisors could flock to, that would teach us about specifically. And I would also say I'd love to see that happen around corporate planning, because there's a separate level there. So unfortunately, there's way too many designations out there. I myself dropped all my CSI designations because I felt they weren't valid or weren't living up to a standard that I held myself to. Too bad, CSI, live with it. The rest of, but the ones I named are all stellar. What I would love to see is a lot of the lower bar designations that are out there that exist to get certifications, to give someone 3 letters behind their name. I want to see them disappear. I want to see them replaced with high caliber things that focus on areas that truly matter. Things like cross-border planning, things like around actual, I mean, what is the one in the US? The Financial Therapy Association. I can't remember if they have a designation or not, but the reality is, like, actually being able to deal with the human side of advice. Like, these are the things that we need to basically hold ourselves up to, is to a professional level designation, not something that checks a box. So those ones, CFP, RFP, CFA, TEP, CPA, good luck finding all of those in one person. If you do, you found someone who actually cares about learning.
RFP is specific to Canada, right?
It is. It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. One other one to mention. I mean, CLU needs an overhaul. It used to be better. I would say that much. It also is not connected to the actual CLU in the US. It's just its own Canadian version. But hopefully they will overhaul that. I know people who've been lobbying for that, but we'll see what happens. But that's a specific life insurance one.
So CLU in Canada, maybe not so interesting. CLU in the US, different though?
Absolutely, it is. I know people who've taught it at the American College, and I know people at the American College, and they hold themselves to a very high standard around around responsibility and best duty of care to the clients. So it's a different bar in different countries. Fortunately, well, I mean, sorry, there's no. There's some of the American College controls the CLU in many countries, not Canada. No alignment.
So financial designations don't always tell the whole story. I agree completely. They show dedication. They show a baseline level of knowledge. How else do you think people should approach evaluating a potential advisor before hiring them?
Look, I wish it was easier, right? I wish that there was a level of professional standard that basically made you feel like you could go to anyone and at least get a base level of knowledge, right? Doctor, you walk into a doctor's office and you believe, and you should, because they're an MD, have a base level of knowledge. CPAs, there's a base level of knowledge established, right? And so like they should hopefully be able to file their taxes without major errors. But we don't have the same kind of criteria yet in Canada. We're starting to get there around planning and everything else. So look, there's lots of checklists online around this, and I think that that's something you should always consider. And a former guest of yours, Harold Geller, and I have done a couple of podcasts on what to look for and red flags and whatever. And I'll tell you some of the key takeaways. First off, you don't want someone who's coming out selling product, right? I've literally had cases where we sat down with prospects, and we've gone through, they've asked us like, well, what'd you invest me? I'm like, we have no idea. Like, we have no idea. We just met you. Like, we got to do the financial plan, the profiling, all this other stuff. And they're like, wow, that's a really different answer than the other people I went to go see. I'm like, what did they say to you? It's like, oh, they said, well, this is how I work. And then they pull out a sheet and say, this is the portfolio I put you in, but don't worry, if you want to change anything, we can. I'm just like, they had the solution, this magic box that somehow met your needs exactly without ever speaking to you. What a magic box that was. I would love to have this magic box that can pull things that are just answers to questions that haven't been asked yet, right? So like, if they're coming out trying to lead with how they're going to outperform, how they're going to protect you, how they're going to give you all this, like, walk away. You've run into a product salesperson. Second piece, is there a process? Is there a process that basically is going to be, that you can hold them to account? I'm going to do this, that, and the other thing. Everybody promises everything in this business. How much of it gets delivered, right? So basically this, that, and the other thing. Okay, great. How is it going to check all the boxes that need to matter to me in my life? And is this clearly, in that conversation, it should be very planning centric. What are the objectives you're trying to do? Is there an inherent amount of, when you're onboarding, inherent amount of financial literacy happening that were basically, they are helping you understand why you're making these decisions, right? What is are they focused on your objectives? Like, our conversations are all about, okay, well, that's nice. We'll get to that. Tell us about you. Tell us about your kids. Tell us about what you want out of life. Is that what you want? And like, we're fishing for understanding what's making them tick, right? Are they doing that? Or are they too busy talking about markets, right? And then when it comes time to talk about markets, are they properly risk profiling you? Are they taking that into consideration? Are they talking more about the downside potential than the upside? Because look, we're all going to get upside over time, but we all got to live with the downside. Are they coaching you and getting you ready for that? Are they basically, if they're going to sell you an insurance product, have they actually quantified the why? Have they done a needs analysis to show you all that, right? Not to say that, again, I don't want to denigrate sales, because sales is a necessary component of what we do. But when it's the thing that is the reason why you're doing it, it's wrong. It should be following the actual line of logic that fits the person's situation. So it's all of those things. And I will say, unfortunately, people will often go to the people they know and say, oh, do you like your financial advisor? Great, make an introduction. It's the blind leading the blind. They don't know.
Right.
They don't know if the person's doing a good job or not.
Speaking of good job, you do a fair amount of expert witness work. What are the biggest red flags you look for when you review a case?
Oof. Usually they're pretty easy to find. So first off, show your work. Like, okay, great, you made recommendations. Like, how did you even arrive at this? Was a risk tolerance assessment of any form, shape or form done? You know, did you even take the time to even fill out the KYC documents properly? Where are your notes? Like, you made a recommendation. What led to this recommendation? Is this actually valid?
Just for context for listeners, so you'll be pulled in as an expert witness to a case where an advisor has apparently done something wrong to harm a
Yep.
client, and
Yes.
you're brought in as the third party expert to evaluate whether they have in fact done something wrong.
Yep, I'll evaluate the work that was done. I'll evaluate it both from a academic and from a quantitative standpoint, where they basically doing that, and a regulatory standpoint that they live up to their duty of care, and potentially any other standards that that person's held up to. And oftentimes, I'll have to assess damages, right? And I'll talk about that at the end. But like, you made a bunch of recommendations. What was it based on, right? Did it come out of thin air? Because here's the reality. If you have them in a portfolio and nothing leading up to that, then my response is, I have no idea how they arrived at this. Do your KYC entries even make any sense? I've literally seen, because we had up in our Know Your Client documents, we have to say, okay, the goals of this account are this much income, this much growth, this much security, high, medium risk, low risk. And then I've seen these ones where it's like, oh, they want 80% income, 20% capital preservation, yet somehow you have them in 95% high risk and speculative. Explain to me how, like, so you're finding where there was, like, you're either demonstrating to me that you had a line of logic and reasoning that led to a conclusion that basically did the best thing for the client, or if you haven't done that, there's deficiencies all the way that I'm looking for. So that's the first thing. Then, did you even understand what it was you were recommending? With the things you said, did they betray the fact that you do not have a knowledge of what the heck you're talking about? Because I will see that. I got a case right now where around some insurance statements where I'm just like, that's empirically invalid. That's not true. That's absolutely not true. You don't even understand the technical things you're talking about. So, one of the things, like, back to designations, licensing, unfortunately, is not really a bar. It's a line on the floor that's easy to step over in some places, right? So the reality is that if you're not trying to uplift your knowledge and understand these things, odds are you're going to make these mistakes. So you have to really understand what it is you're saying, right? Complete and total lack of process. Like, what was the journey you were taking the client through? What did you promise them versus what they actually did? Lack of continuous update and communication, lack of records. I got one right now with a 5-year gap in records. Like, there was changes made in the portfolio. Explain to me how this happened. You're not discretionary manager, but the changes happened, right? And basically, or the same solution for every case. Hey, everybody should be 100% equity. That's an opinion. That ain't fact, and that ain't the law, and that ain't regulation. So, guess what? The second that client complains about you and files a suit, they've got grounds. Now, how do I assess damages? Any number of ways. But the simplest way is to basically say, you gave them a bunch of money over time. What does that line look like? Now, I'm going to properly risk profile them. I'm going to maybe do a bit of a financial plan for them. I'm going to do the proper job along the way. Again, depends on how long it was and if the person's still around, any number of issues. And say, okay, based on reasonable assumptions. By the way, projection assumptions are one of the things people are constantly screwing up. They're like, oh, you're going to grow conservatively at 7.5% to 12%. Excuse me, 12%? 12% conservatively. You looked at the projection guidelines recently? Anyway, and then basically say, your portfolio ended up here. If you had done the right job and put them in a diversified portfolio, they'd end up here. But here's the thing. Let's say they're 100% equity and they end up down here. I had a case very similar to this where they lost $1.2 million. Okay? If they had basically been in a conservative portfolio, look, it was a hard time. It wasn't great. They would have lost like $200,000. So $1 million in damages. But here's the problem. You exposed them to 100% equity risk. They should have been rewarded for that. Never mind what I say the portfolio should have been. What did the globally diversified market portfolio do at the time? Oh, look, it's up here. What did the 100% equity? What did the 100% equity index do at the time for US? Guess what? Now I have 3 data points, and I can argue that if you've done it right, should be here. They should be there. Great. If you've done this right, would it be here? But what actually happened, what you should have done based on your decisions, because you were too busy stock picking and thinking you could beat the market, if you just put it in that market, you would be up here. So suddenly a $1.2 million loss was $2.5 million in damages.
Yeah. And in that case, it's like the client, it's an issue because the client probably didn't realize that they were taking not only equity risk, but they were taking speculative risk from individual security selection. And neither of those probably matched with the appropriate amount of risk for their case.
Well, and let's look at this from an advisor's business perspective. You are going to be held to what the benchmark did. You're going to be held to an appropriate portfolio of benchmarks, and you're also be held to the benchmark of your underlying decisions. And both of those are going to be taken into consideration. And the higher of the two is probably going to be argued. So the reality is that if you're out there thinking you're going to read your analyst research report and make a bunch of stock picks on the top 30 things and do YOLO on NVIDIA or whatever else you're doing, if you had just done the empirically valid thing that is supported by evidence, you wouldn't have that risk exposure.
Yep. Jason, you and I often, we agree on most things, but we often disagree on the extent to which we should engage online with trolls, basically, or with people that we don't agree with. And we've talked about this.
Yes,
we've talked about our disagreement, and I actually do appreciate your logic on it, even though I don't agree with it. Can you explain why you fight trolls on the internet who are spreading financial BS?
Look, if this was like at a conference and one of these people wanted to argue with me, I'd probably just walk away, right? In a lot of cases. Sometimes I don't. It also depends on their footprint, right? Like, oh, this is a dividend blogger who thinks that, like, here's the reality. I'll go back to Edmund Burke, who said something to the effect of, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Okay. So I'm not going to assume that it's evil. Okay. I'll assume Hanlon's razor, which says that, you got to assume ignorance over malice, right? And they're committed to their ignorance. That's fine. But here's the reality. These people may have an audience. These people may be gaining an audience. There's people who are watching. And one thing I learned about social media a long time ago was when I found out how many of my friends were following me and would comment to me, oh yeah, that was a really good conversation. I'm like, dude, you never comment. I don't even know you're on Twitter. Like, what's going on? So there's far more lurkers, people watching, than there are people talking, right? And these people are taking things in. So if we're not out there calling BS, if we're not out there fighting the good fight, I mean, like, there's a certain point you walk away and say enough's enough, right? If we're not basically throwing up evidence against unaccountable nonsense, who's going to do it? And people are going to start, more people will fall into the trap of thinking this is the case. There was a case about 2 years ago with a insurance guy of the US where, like, all of FinTwit united against him because he was so crazy. And like, he's like, oh, this is great. It's feeding me more business. I'm like, you don't understand. You don't understand all the people who aren't coming your way now because of all of us doing this. You think you're winning. You're only seeing this tiny, your selection bias is tiny. But point is that, like, look, it's simple. Give them, people will also, I'll say you this way, you can beat this baseless stuff with logic, math, and academic papers, right? Because most of it's completely baseless. It's based on total misconceptions of the universe. And you give people enough rope, you got to show exactly who they are. And that's when once they finally give up, they start attacking you and they start name calling and they start doing whatever. Great. Do you think you just won anybody over by name calling me, right? Like, you're so right about your argument that you went with a denigration, and yeah, maybe you're in a non, whatever, which means you have no courage in your convictions. But nevertheless, like, look, I've joked, it's a public service, and there's times where, like, so yeah, there'll be times where, Ben, you got it right. I mean, you're gonna go only so far, or someone else will go, and McGrath was pretty good at that for a while, or some other friends we have online will go, or Cliff Asness will just really blow someone up, and I'll just watch and eat popcorn along the way. Look, the reality is that on some level, it is a public service. We are basically, educating. Now, it's not the funnest form of education, I'll say that. My wife will often give me grief for it. But at the end of the day, like, sometimes other people are watching and other people are learning.
Why was it important for you to start the Financial Planning Association of Canada?
And you want the origin story? I'll give you the origin story is interesting. So I was down at the FPA conference in the US several years ago, and I made a friend, and I wandered into the Next Gen group, which is like their young advisors group. And this new president was taking over, and he was talking with such passion about the opportunity they had to transform the industry and create something so beneficial to humanity that he was almost in tears. And I was just like, this place is incredible. And then people started, like, challenging stuff. I'm like, I stand up, I'm like, guys, really respectfully, I'm from Canada. We got none of your stuff up north. I wish I could take you all with me, because we got none of this. And frankly, like, please do everything you're talking about, because you're going to shame the rest of the world into doing the right thing. Like, just do it. And he says to me, why can't you fix it? Like, look, it's complicated, banks, blah, blah, blah. He's like, so no, but seriously, why can't you fix it? Like, I sit down, I'm like, jerk. All right. He threw a gauntlet. So I go up and talk to him afterwards, and he's like, he listens to me for about 2 minutes. Like, so you're not the guy? I'm like, oh man, come on. So I came home, and this has started to happen several times, where I come home from American conferences a little bit depressed about what I was coming back to in terms of an industry, right? I was having these engaging conversations about fiduciary responsibility and elevating the industry and all this other stuff, and I couldn't find, with hundreds of people, I couldn't find a dozen people have that conversation within Canada, and it drove me insane. So, I started talking to friends and colleagues about what the heck am I going to do? I can't do nothing anymore. I don't think we can do nothing. This was when title protection was starting to come about in Ontario, and we were worried it was going to go the wrong direction, and it kind of did, but we're trying to fix it. And I think none of us wanted to start an association, but we felt that there was going to be no other way to move the needle, because we weren't happy with the representation planners had in this country. So we said, okay, great, let's build an association, but how are we going to make sure it's different? And how are we going to prevent it from being co-opted by those who don't have the same belief structure? So we came up with an end state. We created a charter that said, this is the world we are trying to create: fiduciary responsibility, evidence-based, basically best interest of the clients with pure transparency, all of it. We basically said, like, look, there's no other way. There's no other way. We need to create an association, and the charter will serve as a filtering mechanism. And I'll tell you, man, that I get a bunch of hate mail about that charter. And I basically said, look, man, respectfully, as far as I'm concerned, fiduciary responsibility, transparency, all this stuff, that's me saying I stand for unicorns, puppies, and rainbows, man. Like, if you don't believe in what we're talking about, congratulations, you don't have to join. You don't have to join, but the rest of us are going to. And a bunch of people early on, before we even launched, I mean, over 100 advisors planners took the leap of faith and let a bunch of us put this together. And now we stand at over 300 members strong, and we have an incredible community, an incredible engaged community that I'm touched by it all the time. I was meeting with a young guy today who basically is leaving his career because he wants to be a planner, and he thinks it's only possible because he managed to get involved in that pack and basically learn from our forums and get exposed to our education. And I'm sitting there going, like, this is someone who basically, like, legitimately wants to build a better industry and do good for people, and he wouldn't have made a career change if we hadn't enabled and empowered. We've had President's List winners for the CFP's top, like, three placements in the CFP exam, who credit the forums and the education to get with us to this. And more importantly, it's created community, right? It's created a community of people who basically, we're no longer at an island. That's something I found with a lot of the right intentioned planners that have been around for a long time. The older ones was that they were on an island for so long, they didn't have a tribe, right? And we created that tribe. So that's why it was so important. So, the only way we're going to win this is a ground game over time, which is why, like, reaching out to the students and younger planners and right-minded people is, like, that's what's going to win in the long run.
Yep. It is a great community, and it's a great association. I'm a member. Mark McGrath's a member. Dan Bortolotti is also a member, but it's got a great forum. Cameron, I don't think Cameron's a member, but it is a great group.
Yeah.
And it's a great resource for people, like you said, Jason, that are coming into the industry, where there's a group of people with broadly shared beliefs about what the industry should look like. It's a great thing to have.